Hang on. There. Now, hear that? There. Now, did you hear it? It's repeated. The same passage. Here it comes. There you hear it. The basis. I mean, the double basis. And that's me, or us, if you prefer, my colleagues and myself. National Orchestra. Brahms is second. It's quite something. There were 8 of us on that. Or rather, no, 6 of us on that, an average kind of size. There are 8 of us in all. Occasionally, we take on a couple of extra players, and that gets us up to 10. Now, even 12 has been known, and they make a lot of noise, I can tell you. A hell of a lot of noise. Take 12 double basses, huh? And if they give it some elbow, I mean, purely hypothetical this, then you couldn't swamp them with a whole orchestra. Nah, the mere physics of it would make it impossible. They just have to pack up. And on the other hand, nothing functions without us. Ask anyone. Any musician will tell you an orchestra can get along without a conductor anytime, but not without a double bass. See, orchestras have gotten along for centuries without conductors. In fact, in the history of musical development, the conductor is a mere infant, 19th century. I can assure you, even in the National Orchestra, we sometimes play right past the conductor or over his head. Sometimes we play over his head without him even noticing. We let him, swish about up front and just get on with it. Not our own principle, but with a guest conductor, anytime. It's bliss, almost inexpressible. But that's just by the by. You see, there's one thing that's quite inconceivable, and that's an orchestra with no double bass. Yeah. You could even say, now, here's a definition, that it's the presence of a double bass that makes an orchestra. Yeah. You can have orchestras with no first violin, no wind section, no brass, no nothing, but not with no bass. See, what I am driving at is the fact that the double bass is far and away the most important instrument in the whole orchestra. Yes. And does it get the credit for it? It creates a platform for the orchestra, a structure for the remaining instruments, plus conductor to build on. Now, metaphorically speaking, the bass is the cornerstone on which the whole magnificent edifice is erected. Oh yes, you take out the bass and you get pandemonium. Pandemonium, a musical babble with nobody knowing what he's doing and why he's playing at all. Really. Now, just imagine, for example, Schubert's B-flat symphony without the bass. You can forget it. You can forget it. I mean, you can take the entire canon of works for orchestra, A to Z, anything you like, symphonies, concertos, operas, anything, and just throw it away if you've got no double bass. You just throw it in the bin. Or try asking an orchestra player at what point he starts floundering. Ask him. See, it's when he can't hear what the bass is doing. It's catastrophic. Even more obvious with a jazz group. With a jazz group. If the bass stops, the rest of the group would just metaphorically go to pieces. Yes. For the other musicians, nothing. I mean, nothing they do has any meaning anymore. See, I don't go for jazz myself, mind you, nor rock, nor any of that stuff. See, as an artist who has been brought up in the classical tradition of the good and the true and the beautiful, there is nothing I distrust so much as the anarchy of free improvisation. But that's just by the by. See, I only wanted to establish my premise that the double bass is the essential orchestral instrument, par excellence, as everyone knows, really. It's just that no one will admit it publicly because, by nature, see, musicians are rather jealous creatures. right? Take our first violinist, standing there with his violin and having to admit that without the double bass, he'd be like the emperor with no clothes, a ridiculous symbol of his own insignificance and vanity. He wouldn't look good, not at all. I'll have a drink if you don't mind. I'm a modest fellow myself. Yeah. But as a musician, I know where I stand. The Mother Earth, in which we all have our roots. The source of strength that nourishes every musical idea. The truly creative pole from whose loins, I mean, figuratively this is, the musical seed floats forth. It's me. I mean, it's, well, the bass, the double bass. And everything else is the opposite pole. It's only the bass that makes it into a pole. Take a soprano. Huh, talking opera now. See, a soprano is, I don't know, how shall I put it? You see, we've got this young soprano here at the opera, a mezzo soprano. You know, I've heard plenty of voices in my time, but this one is really special. Oh yes, I mean, she moves me to the depths of my soul. Mid-20s, a slip of a thing. Well, I'm 35 myself, 36 in August. And my birthday always happens in the orchestra holidays. But what a woman! Damn it! Oh, an inspiration. Well, just by the by. Now then, the soprano. See, by way of example, it's just about the exact opposite of the double bass. In human terms, in terms of musical sonorities. Well, this soprano, or rather this mezzo soprano, would be the precise polar opposite from which, or maybe towards which, or together with which the double bass, by necessity as it were, would cause a musical spark to fly from one pole to the other, from bass to soprano, or mezzo, and leap up on high, the skylark in allegory, to a divine universal height, eternal and cosmic, instinctually sexual and erotic and infinite as it were, and yet remain tied down to the magnetic field that radiates out from the earthy pediment of the double bass, which is archaic. See, the double bass has something archaic about it, if you know what I mean. And it's this that makes music possible. It's the tension between here and there, I mean, high and low, that gives music its significance. That's where the meaning of music originates from. And of life. Yes, life itself. So, I tell you, this singer, just by the by, her name is Sarah. Yeah, and I promise you someday she'll be right up there. Oh yes, if I know anything about music, and I do, then she's got a terrific future ahead of her. And it's us in the orchestra that gave her her start. In particular, we bassists, specifically me. It's a pretty satisfying kind of involvement. Fine. Now, to recap, the double bass is the pivotal instrument in the whole orchestra on account of its fundamental depth. Yes. In one word, the double bass is the deepest of all the string instruments. It goes down, down as far as bottom E. Here, I'll play you one. Hold on. By the way, this bow is the best thing about the whole instrument. Yes, it's a Frechner, worth about, 800 euros now. I got it for 120. Yep, it's amazing the way prices have shot up in the last 10 years. Oh, yes. Anyhow, listen carefully. Hear that? Bottom E. Exactly 41.2 hertz, if it's in tune. Now, on some bases, we can go even lower, down to bottom C or B. Now that's 30.9 hertz. But you need a 5-string bass for that. Mine here has got 4, right? Put a 5th one on, it will snap. Too much strain. We've got a couple with 5 strings in the orchestra. Yep. You need them on Wagner, for instance. Oh, yes. Doesn't sound that wonderful, though. I mean, 30.9 is hardly a note anymore in the accepted sense. You can imagine when, listen, even this is more of a sawing than a note. There's something rather desperate about it. It doesn't tone so much as buzz. So, my existing tonal range is quite sufficient for me, really. And at the top of this scale, I've got theoretically no limits whatsoever, just practical ones. For instance, if I go right to the top of the fingerboard, right, I can play high C, right? There, thrice accented C. Now you'll say that's the limit, right? Because you can't play a note that's off the end of the fingerboard. Well, that's what you think. Now what about this, and this, and this? Well, those are harmonics, the lightest of touches on a string, and you tease out the overtones, right? Now, don't ask me about the physics of it just at the moment. I mean, you can look it up yourself in the encyclopedia, or rather, well, Wikipedia when you get home. Anyhow, theoretically, I can play so high as to be inaudible. Here. Hear that? You can't, can you? See, the instrument can do so much physically, theoretically, only musically it's never brought out. Exactly the same thing with the horns and with people in general. Metaphorically now, I know people. They've got a whole world of possibilities within them, absolutely immeasurable potential. Desperate, only it's never tapped. But that's just by the by. Now, 4 strings. E, A, D, G. Now, all chrome-plated steel, right? Used to have gut. Now, this one, the G, is used in solo passages. Well, when there are any. In fact, strings cost a fortune, you know. Yeah. I think a set of them would cost you more than, what, at least 150 euros now. They were about 20, 30, 40 when I started. Prices are amazing. Anyhow, 4 strings, tuned in fourths. E, right? And B or C on the 5th string, if you're using one. And that's the way it is all over the world, from the Chicago Symphony to the Moscow State. But the aggravation there was before we ever got there. Different tunings, different number of strings, different sizes. No other instrument came in at different versions as much as the double bass. None. You wouldn't mind if I have a drink now and again. Excuse me. I suffer from this terrible dehydration. You know, all through the 17th and 18th centuries, there was anarchy. I mean, complete anarchy. Bass gamba, large bass viol, violone with frets, supra violone without frets, tunings in thirds, fourths, and fifths, 3, 4, 6, or even 8 strings, F sound holes, C sound holes, absolute madness. In England and France, they used 3-string basses. 3-string basses tuned in fifths up into the 19th century. Now, in Austria and Germany, they had a 4-string, tuned in fourths. In the end, theirs was the one that prevailed, the 4 strings, simply because at the time, they had the better composers. Now, even though a 3-string bass actually has a better tone, less scratchy, more tuneful, just better. But against that, they had Haydn, Mozart, the Bach songs, and then of course, Beethoven, and all the romantics. Now, they couldn't have cared less about the way a bass sounded. See, for them, a bass was just a carpet of sound on which they could arrange their symphonic furniture. Still, the greatest music there is of that kind, up until the present day. And quite frankly, all that rests squarely on the shoulders of the 4-string double bass. The entire orchestral music of more than 200 years, from 1750 to our century. And it was with that music that we swept aside the 3-string bass. As you can imagine, though, it put up quite a struggle. Oh yes. In Paris, at the Opera and the Conservatoire, they were still playing 3-string basses in 1832. 1832. Now, that was the year Goethe died. But then Cherubini put a stop to it. Luigi Cherubini, an Italian, but musically more in tune with Central Europe, was a fan of Gluck, Haydn, and Mozart. He was in charge at the Paris Opera, and he made changes. You can imagine what it was like. Waves of indignation in the ranks of the French bass players as this Germanophile Italian takes away their 3-string basses. You see, the French are a pretty shirty lot anyway, yeah? Whenever there's revolution in the air, you can bet the French will be in on it, as happened in the 18th century, the 19th, even the 20th, in our own time. Yeah. I was in Paris at the beginning of May, and you see, the dustmen were on strike. The metro was on strike. They were having power cuts 3 times a day, and there were 15,000 Frenchmen out demonstrating. You've got no idea what the place looked like afterwards. There wasn't a single shop they hadn't smashed up, not one. Windows broken, cars vandalized, posters and leaflets chucked around, everything just left there. I tell you, it was pretty alarming. Anyway, but that time, in 1832, no use. The 3-string bass disappeared for good. See, that kind of diversity of form just couldn't go on any longer. All the same, it's a pity because, well, it did sound so much better than this one here. Less range, but a better tone. Yeah. But that's the way it goes. superior class dies out in face of the current trend. In this case, it was our classical composers who pitilessly finished off whatever stood in their way. Not on purpose. I wouldn't want to say that. They were decent people as such, if you look at them. I mean, Schubert wouldn't hurt a fly. And if Mozart was a bit of a vulgarian at times, he was also a highly sensitive human being and not at all given to violence. Nor was Beethoven, despite his tantrums. You know, Beethoven smashed quite a few pianos in his time. Never a double bass, though. You have to say that for him. Well, he couldn't play one either, mind you. In fact, the only decent composer who played the double bass, I think, was Brahms. Yeah, or was it his father? Anyway, Beethoven couldn't play any string instruments, just the piano. And people are apt to forget that nowadays. Unlike Mozart, whose violin playing was almost on a level with his piano. I suppose, well, Schubert might have managed it. Might have. Only he didn't write any. He was no virtuoso either. No, Schubert was certainly no virtuoso. I mean, he wasn't the type to be one, and nor did he have the technical facility. Can you, I mean, listen, really, can you imagine Schubert as a virtuoso? I can't. But he had a perfectly decent singing voice, though. I mean, in fact, for a time, he used to sing in a vocal quartet every week, along with Nistelrooy, by the way. Didn't know that, did you? Nistelrooy, the best baritone. That's Schubert's Lied, An die Musik, German for To Music. It was composed in 1817 to the text of a dear friend of his, Franz von Schubert. But why am I telling you all this? I mean, it's nothing whatever to do with the matter in hand. I mean, if you really want to know the kind of a voice Schubert had, then fine. You can go look it up in his biography anytime. Why should I tell you? After all, I'm not a musical information bureau. See, the double bass is the only instrument you can actually hear better the farther you are away from it. And that's a problem. Look, I've had this whole place soundproofed. The walls, floors, ceiling. The door is a double door, lined inside. The windows are double glazed with special glass and insulated frames. Cost an absolute fortune. But you know what? It cuts out more than 95% of the noise. I mean, can you hear anything? I live right in the middle of town. You don't believe me? Hang on. Wow, you hear that? You hear that? That's as loud as Berlioz is today. Filthy. They're knocking a hotel down over there, and they've spent the last 2 years building a metro station under the crossroads. So all the traffic has been rerouted this way. Really. And as it's a Wednesday, or what is it today? Anyway, they're collecting the rubbish, which accounts for that rhythmic crashing. Listen. There, that banging, that brutal hammering is 102 decibels. Really, I measured it once. I think I've proved my point. I'll shut the window again. There. That showed you. Is it or isn't it soundproofed? Makes you wonder how people used to live before, because see, if you think there used to be less noise about, well, you'd be wrong. Wagner writes that he couldn't find a flat in the whole of Paris because every street had its own tinsmith. Yeah. And even then, I think I'm right in saying Paris had over 1 million inhabitants. Now, as for tinsmiths, I don't know if you've ever heard one, but I reckon it's about the most hellish din imaginable for a musician. A man who keeps banging on a piece of metal with a hammer. And in those days, people used to work from dawn to dusk. So we're told. On top of that, the rattling of carriages on the cobblestones, the cries of the vendors in the marketplace, and all the fights and the revolutions that were going on the whole time with ordinary French men, the lowest rabble, right out in the street. And then they started building the metro at the end of the 19th century. And I don't suppose they were any more discreet about that than they are nowadays. Now, as regards Wagner, well, actually I'm not exactly an enthusiast, but that's by the by. Right, now, we're going to conduct an experiment. Pay attention. See, this bass is a perfectly ordinary instrument, made in about, 1910? Probably in South Tyrol. The body is 1 meter 12, 1.92 up to the scroll. The string is 1.12 too. Not an outstanding bit of craftsmanship, yeah? But, well, probably better than average. I could get about 2,500 for it. I got it for 700. Crazy, huh? I'll play you a note. Really, anything. Let's say, why not? Let's say bottom F. Hear that? Now that's pianissimo, all right. Now, I'll play piano. Don't mind the grating, okay? It's like that. A clean tone without the scratch of the bowing, purely the string vibrating. You wouldn't get that anywhere. Now, not even Yehudi Menuhin could bring it off. Really, right. Now, pay attention. I'm going to play between mezzo forte and forte. Remember now, a fully soundproofed room. Now, we just have to wait a moment. Just a minute. It wouldn't be long now. Hear that? There. That's Frau Niemeyer upstairs. As soon as she hears the slightest noise, she knocks. And that's when I know I've strayed into mezzo forte. Decent enough woman in other respects, but standing here right next to it, it doesn't even sound all that loud. It's pretty quiet, really. Now, if I were to play fortissimo, right? Now, you wouldn't think that was all that loud, you know? But the sound goes right through Frau Niemeyer's flat and all the way downstairs to the caretaker and across to the house next door. And then they'll be getting on the phone about it later. Now, that's what I call the penetrating force of the instrument. Yes, brought about by the very low vibrations. See, you'd think, say, a flute or a trumpet would be louder. Not so. No carry, no penetration, no body, yeah? As they say in America, I've got body. Anyway, my bass has got body. It's about the only thing I like about it. It's about the only thing it's got, really. Apart from that, it's a fucking disaster. Valkyrie Overture. It's like the theme from Jaws. Double bass and cello in unison. We play roughly half the notes that are on that score. That bit, right? That bit, that slither of notes there is in fact made up of quintuplets and sextuplets. There are 6 individual notes there. At that incredible speed, it's completely unplayable. You just play anything. In fact, it's not known whether Wagner was aware of the problem or not. Probably not. Anyway, he couldn't have cared less. He despised orchestras. Hence, the famous covers in Bayreuth, ostensibly on the grounds of acoustics. But in actual fact, because of his hatred of the orchestra. It was just impression of the sound that he cared about. You know, theater music, background, Gesamtkunstwerk, all that. Who gives a damn about a single note? Same applies in Beethoven's 6th, the Pastoral, or Rigoletto, Last Act. See, whenever there's a storm scene, they just put down whatever notes come into their heads. Never mind if no bass on earth could ever hope to play them. Not a hope. The stunts we expect of the performance it is. We have to put in the most effort of anyone. I'm always soaked in sweat at the end of a concert. I can never wear the same shirt twice. On average, I lose about 2 liters of liquid in course of an opera and about 1 liter in a symphony concert. Some of my colleagues do jogging or weight training. Not me, I know, but one of these days I'll get so knackered playing I'll never be the same again. Because really, playing the double bass is a question of brute force. Brute force. You have to press down each string like crazy. That's why children never learn the double bass. I started when I was, 17? I'm 35 now. I didn't take it up out of choice. It was more by accident. Like the Virgin's pregnancy. By way of the recorder, violin, trombone, and Dixieland. But that was a long time ago. I've got no use for jazz anymore. Come to mention it, I can't think of any of the others becoming a double bassist by choice either. Makes sense, really. It's not exactly a manageable instrument. It's more of an obstacle than a musical instrument. It's not possible to pick it up and carry it. So it just has to trail along behind you everywhere. And if it ever falls over, then it's had it. It'll only go in a car if you take out the front passenger seat. And that's your car pretty well full. In the house, you have to give it a wide berth. It stands there so stupidly. It's not like a piano. You see, a piano is like a piece of furniture. You could put the lid down and forget about it. Not the double bass. It stands around the whole time. See, there was this uncle of mine who was always ill and always complained that there was no one looking after him. The double bass is just like that. If you have friends around, it always hugs the limelight. No one will talk about anything else. And if you want him to be alone with a woman, it stands there, looming over you. You get intimate, it watches. See, you always have the feeling it's laughing at you. And you get also self-conscious. And then it gets to her too. And then there's no, only that thin line between making love and making a fool of yourself, and the ghastliness of it, the wretchedness. Shouldn't be allowed. Excuse me. I know I'm straying off the subject. You'll say, what is it to you, right? Well, perhaps it even embarrasses you. Well, you may have problems of your own. We all do. It's just infuriating, though. And I'd like to be allowed to say that just once. Because, see, as a member of the National Orchestra, you might think we somehow spared all that. See, the fact is, I haven't been with a woman in 2 years. And whose fault is it? The last time was in, 2013, I believe. Yep. Then I hid it in the bathroom. But that didn't help either. See, its ghost was still fluttering above us like a fermata. Now, if I ever get a woman again, and as I'm already 35, it's a bit unlikely. But then again, there are worse looking men than me. And I'm a civil servant after all. And it's perfectly possible that I should fall in love. In fact, I have fallen in love. Oh, I'm not sure. I think I have. I haven't told her yet. See, it's the one I was saying earlier, from the ensemble at the opera, that young singer, Sarah. Well, it's hardly likely, I suppose, but if we ever get that far, then I'll make sure we go around to her place. Yes, or go to a hotel, or somewhere in the country, if it's not raining. You know, if there's one thing it can't stand, then it's rain. Rain makes it shrivel up, or rather makes it swell up like a sponge. It really doesn't like that at all. And the cold too, the cold warps it. And then it wants tempering for at least 2 hours before you are able to play it. See, before, when I was playing in this chamber orchestra, we had engagements every other day in these places out in the middle of nowhere, in a castle, a church, some winter festival or other. There are all kinds of things. Anyway, I always had to drive out a couple of hours ahead of everyone else in my Beetle, alone, just so I could temper my bass in some squalid pub or by a stove in a vestry like some old invalid. You know, we've been through a lot together. And it's love, I can tell you. Yeah. Once we broke down in a snowstorm, December of 2009, I believe, between Étal and Oberhau. Waited 2 hours for help to arrive. I gave it the coat off my back, warmed it with my own body. So when we got to the concert, it was nicely tempered. And I'd caught the most awful flu. A drink, if you don't mind. No. You really aren't born to be a bass player. You get there by all kinds of detours and accidents and disappointments. There is not one out of the 8 of us bass players in the orchestra who hasn't been shockingly treated by life. Not one. You can read it in our faces. Oh yes. Take the career of a typical bass player, one like myself. Dominant father, civil servant, unmusical. Weak mother, flutist, artistic inclinations. As a child, I worshiped my mother. My mother loves my father. My father loves my little sister. No one loves me. Subjectively speaking, I think. Out of hatred for my father, I decided not to become a civil servant, but an artist. Yeah. And to take it out on my mother, I choose the biggest, most ungainly instrument there is. And in order to cause her mortal offense, as it were, and to give my father the coup de grace at the same time, I become a civil servant after all. As a double bassist in the National Orchestra, 3rd desk. And there, I violate my mother every day in the guise of my double bass, largest of the feminine instruments, shape-wise that is. And this unending symbolic incest is, of course, morally speaking, atrocious every time. And it's this moral atrocity that haunts every one of us in the orchestra. I think so much for the psychoanalytical aspect of the instrument. Yeah, but the insight doesn't help much because psychoanalysis is washed up anyway. We all know it. Even psychoanalysis itself knows it. Because, first of all, see, psychoanalysis throws up many more questions than it's capable of answering. Yeah, like a hydra that keeps chopping off its own heads. And that's the insoluble self-contradiction which is choking psychoanalysis. Yes. And then, secondly, there's the fact that psychoanalysis has become a commonplace, as everyone knows, really. Look, there are 126 of us in the orchestra, and over half are in analysis. Over half are in analysis. So, as you can see, what was a sensational scientific breakthrough 100 years ago, or might have been, is now so incredibly normal that no one gives it another thought. No one. I mean, does it surprise you to hear that 10% of people are depressive? Yes, 10% of us are depressive. Really. Of us are depressive. In fact, I don't need analysis to tell me that. In fact, it would have been much better, while we're on the subject, if they'd had psychoanalysis available 100 years ago. Yes, that might have spared us a fair bit of Wagner, for instance. Wagner. I mean, the man was blatantly neurotic. Oh yes. Take his greatest work, Tristan. Now, how did that come about? How did that come about? See, it was purely because Wagner was having this affair with the wife of a friend who had been supporting him for years. I mean, for years. And this breach of trust, this, how shall I put it, this squalid behavior made him so disgusted with himself that he had to sit down and write what is claimed to be the greatest romantic tragedy of all time. Complete suppression by complete sublimation. Hörst du Lust? Oh, and you know, in those days, adultery was still comparatively unusual. Now just imagine Wagner had taken this problem to an analyst. You can bet on one thing. There would have been no Tristan. That's for certain. There wouldn't have been enough neurosis left to produce it. Now, he beat his wife too. Did Wagner. The first one, of course, not the second, definitely not the second, but the first, oh yes, a pretty unpleasant type altogether, Wagner. He could be friendly as hell, I mean, really charming, but unpleasant. I mean, well, I think he must have hated himself too, you know, because, see, he kept getting this rash on his face from loathing. Oh well, but women were wild about him. Oh yes, exercised a powerful attraction on women. Wagner. Don't ask me why. You know, women play a subordinate role in music. I mean, in the actual creative process, in composition. Yes, women play a subordinate role. Or can you name a single celebrated female composer? Just one. There, see? Have you ever thought about that before? Think about it sometime. Or maybe taking the whole feminine aspect of music. I mean, the double bass is a female instrument. Despite its grammatical gender, it is a female instrument. Yes. The same way death is also female. Speaking associatively now, in its enveloping cruelty, or if you prefer, the way it functions as a kind of terminal womb, but also as it complements the life principle, fertility, Mother Earth, and so on. Am I right? See, so in this function, talking music again, the double bass is a death symbol, fighting the absolute void that confronts both life and music. That's right. In this light, we double bassists are like Kerberos, guarding the catacombs of the void. Or, alternatively, like Sisyphus, rolling the sensory weight of the whole of music up the mountainside. Now just picture it to yourselves. Despised and spat at, and with half-gnawed liver. No, that was the other fellow, huh? Prometheus. Apropos, see, last summer, the whole of the National Opera Company went to Orange in the south of France. Festival, gala performance of Siegfried. Now, just try and imagine it. The amphitheater of Orange, a building getting on for 2,000 years old, a flower of classical architecture from one of the most civilized epochs in history, and under the eyes of the Emperor Augustus, as it were, the rampaging Germanic gods, the fire-breathing dragon, Siegfried, swaggering across the stage, fat and gross, bush, as the French say. See, we were paid, well, 400 euros each, but I still found the whole thing so dramatic. I was only able to play about a fifth of the notes. And you know what we did afterwards? The entire orchestra. We went out and got completely arse-holed. We behaved like hooligans, careering about at 3 a.m. And the police were called. We felt so desperate. Now, unfortunately though, see, the singers were off getting pissed in a group by themselves. They never go around with us in the orchestra. Sarah. Oh, Sarah. Remember that young singer, Sarah? She was with them. She was singing Woodbird. And they were staying at a different hotel from us, too. Otherwise, there was a chance. I mean, a chance we might have met. In fact, I know someone, I think so, yeah. I know someone who had an affair with a singer. It went on for 1.5 years. But he was a cellist. And you know, a cello is not as awkward as a double bass. Nah, it doesn't thrust itself quite so forcefully between two lovers, or would-be lovers. And there are any number of solo passages for cello. I mean, we're talking prestige now. Tchaikovsky's Piano Concerto, Schumann's Fourth Symphony, Don Carlos, and so on. And even so, I tell you, my friend was completely destroyed by that singer of his. Yes. He had to learn the piano in order to be able to accompany her. She simply insisted on it. And out of love, well, anyway, within a very short time, he'd already become the répétiteur of the woman he loved. An awful one, incidentally. See, whenever they appeared together, she always put him in the shade. She simply humiliated him. Now that's the dark side of the moon of love. And yet, on the cello, He was far and away the better musician. There was just no comparison between them. None whatsoever. But he had to accompany her. It's what he wanted. And you know, there's not enough literature for cello and soprano. Precious little, in fact. Almost as little as for double bass and soprano. You know, I'm lonely a lot of the time. Yeah. I mostly sit around at home on my own when I'm not working. Listen to a few recordings. Maybe practice. I don't get any enjoyment out of it. It's always the same. And tonight is the festival premiere of Rheingold. And Carlo Maria Giulini is over to conduct us. The minister-president will be sitting in the front row, crème de la crème. Tickets up to €1,000 each. Crazy. But I don't care. Nonsense. I'm not even practicing for it. See, there are 8 of us on Rheingold, so it hardly matters what one individual plays. So long as the lead player is all right, the rest just falling behind him. Sarah, Sarah is singing too. Weltkunde, right at the beginning. It's a big part for her. Who knows, it might make her name. But pity you have to make your name doing Wagner. Well, but you can't choose your composer for the occasion. Singers can't, and we can't either. You know, normally, we rehearse from, 10 till 1, and the performance is 7 till 10, okay? And the rest of the time, I spend at home, here in my music room. Drink a few beers against the dehydration. Sometimes I sit my bass in the basket chair over there, put the bow in with it, and come and sit in this armchair here. And then I look at it, and I think, what a horrible instrument. Go on, look at it. It's like a fat old woman, isn't it? Hips far too low, waist a disaster, much too high up, and still too wide. And then those narrow, sloping, rickety shoulders, right? Enough to drive you around the bend, right? See, that's because the double bass, it's a hybrid in terms of the history of its evolution. Yeah. Look, the bottom half is like a big violin. The top half is a big gamba. Look, the double bass is the ugliest, the nastiest, most graceless instrument ever to be invented. A real pig of an instrument. Sometimes I feel like smashing it, right? Or sawing it to pieces, taking an axe to it, cut into tiny pieces and grind it up fine and pulverize it and fit it into a wood-burning automobile and drive away. No, you really couldn't say I was in love with it. And it's vile to play. For 3 semitones, you need the whole span of your hand. 3 semitones, watch. And if I play all the way up one string, and that's changing position 11 times. It's a question of brute force. You have to press down each string like crazy. Here, look at my fingers. The tips are calloused. See? There are grooves etched into them, hard as anything. You wouldn't feel a thing with those fingers. In fact, once, a while ago, I burnt them and felt nothing. I only noticed from the smell of my own skin burning. Self-mutilation is what it is. My fingertips are harder than a blacksmith's. Although, actually, I've got fine hands, right? Quite wrong for a double bass. After all, I did start off on a trombone. And to begin with, I didn't have much strength in my right arm, and you need it for bowing. Otherwise, you wouldn't get that damn crate to produce any kind of noise, never mind a beautiful one. Or rather, you wouldn't get a beautiful note out of it under any circumstances. I mean, those aren't notes. I don't want to be coarse, but I tell you what they are. A nasty surprise in the sound department. No one can play the double bass beautifully. Not if the word is to mean anything. No one. Not the greatest soloist. See, it's a question of physics, not of ability. A double bass doesn't have the upper range. It just doesn't. And that's why solo playing on the double bass is so colossally stupid. Even if playing techniques have kept improving over the last 150 years. And even if there are concertos for double bass, and sonatas, and suites, and even if one day, I mean just one day, some Superman should come along and play Bach's Chaconne on a double bass, or one of Paganini's Capriccios. Now, it is and always will be ghastly, because it's a ghastly noise. And that's all there is to it. Right. And now, I'll play you the standard work for double bass. Okay? The icing on the cake. The real jewel in the crown. The concerto by Karl Ditters von Dittersdorf. Now, just listen to this little edited excerpt of it. Okay? Now just listen to this cadenza coming up. Oh. There. That's it. Dittersdorf. E major concerto for double bass and orchestra. Actually, his name was plain Ditters. Karl Ditters. Dates are 1739 to 1799. Also worked as a forestry commissioner. Now, tell me, honestly, what did you make of that? Would you like to hear it again? Not in terms of the composition, I mean more the quality of the noise. I mean, what about the cadenza? Would you like to hear the cadenza again? I mean, that cadenza makes me die laughing. The whole thing really makes me want to cry. And it's played by a respected soloist. I wouldn't give her her name. It's really not her fault. In fact, it's not Dittersdorf's fault. Yeah, you see, people had to write things like that. They were commissioned from on high, way on high, and he wrote an incredible amount of it. I mean, Mozart's production was piffling by comparison. Over 100 symphonies, 30 operas, a whole stack of piano sonatas, and other bits and bobs. Really. Among them, that one you just heard for double bass. In fact, all in all, there are more than, 50 concertos for double bass and orchestra, and all of them by lesser known composers. Or have you ever heard of Johann Spreger? Or Domenico Dragonetti? Or Bottesini? Or Simandl? Or Kusevitsky? Or Hottel? Or Van Hal? Or Otto Geyer? Or Hofmeister? Or Ottmar Klose? Have you heard of any of them? Now those are the luminaries of the double bass, all of them. People like me, really, double bassists who out of frustration, turn their hands to composition. Yes. I mean, their concertos sound like it too. Look, no self-respecting composer would write for double bass. No, he'd have more taste. And if he ever did, well, it would be as a joke. Look, there's a little minuet by Mozart. Crucial number 344, I believe. Hysterical. Hysterical. Or number 5 in Saint-Saëns' Carnival of the Animals, the elephant, for solo double bass and piano, allegretto pomposo, 1.5 minutes. Hysterical. Hysterical. Oh, in Richard Strauss's Salome, that 5-part double bass passage where Salome is looking down into the well. How black it is down there. How awful to live in such a dark hole. It's like a dungeon. 5 double basses in that passage. The effect is grisly. Makes your hair stand on end when you listen to it. When you play it too, for that matter. Terrifying. Should do more chamber music, I suppose. I'd even enjoy it. But who would take me and my bass in that quintet? It's not worth it. If they need a bass, they can always hire one for the occasion. Same with a septet or an octet, right? They wouldn't take me. No. There are 2 or 3 bass players in Germany who've got the whole thing sewn up. One, because he's got his own concert agency. Another, because he's in the Berlin Philharmonic. And the third has got a professorship in Vienna. Now, how am I going to compete with that? How? But there's such a nice quintet by Dvorak and Janacek, and even Beethoven's septet. Sublime. Beethoven's septet. Or, well, maybe Schubert's Trout Quintet. Now that's the absolute peak, talking musical careers now. A double bassist dream. Schubert. But there's a fat chance of that. I'm just a tutti player. That means I sit at the 3rd desk. The 1st desk is for the soloist and reserved soloist. The 2nd is for the leader and reserved leader. Then come the tutti players. It's less about proficiency than career structure. You see, and you must realize that an orchestra is and must remain a strongly hierarchical organization, and as such, an image of human society as a whole. Not of any particular society, but human society in general. I mean, soaring high above everyone else, is the principal conductor. Yes. Then comes the 1st violin, and then the 1st, 2nd violin, and then the 2nd, 1st violin, And then the rest of the first and the second violins, the violas, cellos, flutes, oboes, clarinets, bassoons, and horns, and right at the very end, the double bass. The only thing that comes really after us are the timps. But that's only theoretically, because in fact, the timps take up an elevated position on their own, so everyone can see them. Besides, they have even more volume than we do. So when the timpanist lets fly, you can hear that right at the back of the stalls. And everyone says, aha, the timps. But no one says, aha, the double bass. Because, see, I'm just one of a crowd. And that's why, in practical terms, the timps are really ahead of the double bass. Now, even though with only 4 notes, you could hardly call them an instrument, right? But then again, there are timpanist solos. For instance, in Beethoven's 5th piano concerto, right? Last movement. Very, very end of that, where the piano goes bum, 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 timpani, bum, bum. Anyway, the very tail end of that concerto, anyone not listening, or rather not watching the piano, will be watching the timps. And in a decent-sized concert hall, that could easily be 12 or 1,500 people. I don't get that many watchmen in the course of an entire season. Yes. Don't think I'm envious, though. Far be it from me to be envious. I know what I'm worth. But I do have a sense of justice and fair play. And some things in music are absolutely unfair. The soloist is covered with applause. I mean, audiences nowadays feel they've been punished if they're not allowed to clap. Ovations for the conductor. The conductor will shake the orchestra's leader's hand at least twice. Sometimes the whole orchestra rise to their feet. Yes. But as a double bassist, you're not even allowed to stand up properly. As a double bassist, you really are an insignificant little shit. Excuse my French. And that's why I say the orchestra is an image of society. It's the same thing in both. The people who do the dirty work are also despised for it by everyone else. In fact, it's even worse than society, because at least in society, theoretically speaking, I'd have some hope of climbing up the ladder and one day being able to look down from the top at all the pathetic creatures wriggling around below me. There'd be some hope. But here in the orchestra, there is no hope. There is the cruel hierarchy of ability, the terrible hierarchy of the decision once made, the appalling hierarchy of talent, and the awful hierarchy of tones and frequencies. No. Don't ever join an orchestra. Well, I suppose there have been some changes, so-called. The most recent was, over 150 years ago, and concerned the seating arrangements of the orchestra. That's when Weber put the horn section behind the strings. It was a real revolution. Didn't do anything for the double bass, mind you. We're still stuck right at the back, then as now. We've been at the back ever since the end of the continuo era in 1750, and will remain there. And I'm not complaining either. I've got my head screwed on. Yeah. And I bow to necessity. God knows I have learned to. And it has my support. See, as a player in an orchestra, I'm a conservative. And I back words like order, discipline, hierarchy, and leadership. Now, don't get me wrong now. See, words like that tend to remind Germans of Adolf Hitler. Yeah. But Hitler was just a Wagnerian. And as you know, I'm pretty dismissive of Wagner. Yes. As a musician, talking technical aptitude now, I'd say Wagner belonged in the fifth form. A score of Wagner is just full of errors. I mean, errors and impossibilities. I mean, the man himself couldn't play a single instrument except the piano, and that badly. Your professional musician feels 1,000 times, I mean 1,000 times happier with Mendelssohn, not to mention Schubert. And as the name suggests, see, Mendelssohn was a Jew. That's right. Now, as for Hitler, he had no idea of music, apart from Wagner. In fact, he never wanted to be a musician himself either. He was more in the line of architect, painter, town planner, that sort of thing. Yeah, at least he had enough vision to see that, despite all his general lack of restraint, I suppose. See, musicians weren't very susceptible to Nazism anyway, despite Furtwängler, Richard Strauss, and that awkward cases I know. But too much is made of them. They were never, I mean, never Nazis in any positive sense. Nazism and music? Music and Nazism? Phew. Nah, they just don't mix. I mean, read what Furtwängler has to say about it. They just don't mix. No way. And of course, they carried on making music, though. And why not? Music doesn't just curl up and die. Karl Böhm, for instance, he was in his prime. And so was Karajan, Herbert von Karajan. In fact, the French feted him in occupied Paris, while even the prisoners in the concentration camps had orchestras. And so I'm told. Now, same thing later on with the German, in the German POWs in their camps. So, there's something, I mean, something deeply human about making music. Yes, beyond politics and current affairs, something human and universal. It's like an innate, irrepressible part of the soul of man. There will always be music all over the world. In South Africa, in Scandinavia, in Brazil, and in the Gulag Archipelago. Music is metaphysical, you know? Metaphysical, meaning behind or beyond merely physical existence, beyond time and history and politics, rich and poor, life and death. Music is eternal. Goethe says, music is something so elevated that it cannot be understood by the intellect. Yes, and its effect is such that it governs all things, that no one is able to give an account of it, to which I can only say, amen. In fact, I would even go further than Goethe. I would say that the older I get, and the more deeply I penetrate into the true nature of music, the more I understand that music is a great mystery. And that the more you know about it, the less you are able to say anything about it at all. I mean, Goethe, for all the reputation he still enjoys today, and rightly so, he wasn't in the strict sense a musical man. Now, first and foremost, he was a poet. And as such, he understood rhythm and speech melody. Doesn't make him a musician, though. Otherwise, how could he explain his occasionally grotesque misjudgments of musicians? But he knew a lot about mysticism. Oh, yes. I don't know if you knew. See, Goethe was a pantheist. Probably. Now, pantheism is very closely related to mysticism. It's an expression of the mystical view of the world, like Taoism and Indian mysticism, etc., through the Middle Ages and the Renaissance and so on, and then surfacing again in the 18th century Freemasonry movement, among other things. So, I think you might remember that Mozart was a Freemason. Right. He joined the movement when he was very young still, but already as a musician. That's right. And as I see it, and in fact, and he must have known it himself. And that proves my thesis that for him, Mozart, music ultimately remained a mystery. And that at the time, his knowledge simply couldn't take him any further in his view of the world. Now, it gets a bit complicated, and you're probably not qualified. But you see, I've spent years working on this subject, and I'll tell you this. Namely that, especially seen against such a background, Mozart is extremely overrated. Yes, I mean, as a musician, yes, Mozart is extremely overrated. No, really. I know it sounds a little unfashionable to say so today, but as someone who spent years studying the material and on a professional basis, I can tell you that if you compare Mozart to hundreds of his contemporaries, you'll find that he was no better and no worse than them. And the fact that he was so gifted as a child and began composing at the age of 8, well, that's actually what finished the man off so quickly. And the responsibility for that should be laid at the door of his father, who behaved scandalously. I mean, I wouldn't make my son if I had one, and if he was 10 times as gifted as Mozart, because let's face it, what does it mean? A child composing? Listen, any child will compose if you train it up like a little monkey. There's absolutely nothing remarkable about that. It's just cruel. It's torturing the child. Thank God there are laws against that nowadays. Because, see, children have a right to freedom. That's the first thing. The second is that, see, at the time Mozart was composing, there was practically nothing else around. Nothing. Beethoven, Schubert, Weber, Chopin, Wagner, Strauss, Leoncavallo, Brahms, Verdi, Tchaikovsky, Bartók, Stravinsky. I can't even make a list of them all. In fact, 95% of the music that's just a part of us nowadays has to be a part of us. Yes, especially if we happen to be professional musicians. At the time, it just wasn't extant. It only came into existence after Mozart was dead. Mozart was familiar with none of it. None. In fact, the only composer who came before him, and, well, correct me if I'm wrong on this, was Bach. Johann Sebastian Bach. The only great composer who came before Mozart was Bach, Johann Sebastian Bach. And he'd been totally forgotten because he was a Protestant, you see? And it was left to our own day and age to rediscover him. And that's why things were so infinitely easier for Mozart. Yeah, he was unencumbered. He could wander around without a care in the world, play and compose with freshness, just about whatever he liked. And at that time, people show far more gratitude too. In fact, if I had been alive then, I'd have been a world-famous virtuoso. That Mozart has never conceded. Unlike Goethe, who showed more honesty there. Goethe always said he was lucky that, see, in his time, literature was pretty much a blank page. He was lucky. A jammy bastard, as we say. Mozart never owned up to that. And I like to reproach him for it. I'll say it loud and clear because, see, I get annoyed by that sort of thing. And this, just by way of a footnote, what Mozart wrote for double bass, you can forget it. Forget it. Well, fair enough. Okay, just with the exception of the last act of Don Giovanni. Nothing there. I mean, nothing. So much for Mozart. Damn it. Now, I must have another drink. Oh. Well. Watch where you're going, for Christ's sake. Always in the way. The damn object. Now tell me if you can, why a grown man in his mid-30s, namely me, should have to live with an instrument that's a constant handicap to him, humanly, socially, sexually, musically, in traffic, nothing but a handicap. Puts the mark of Cain on him. Can you tell me that? I'm sorry I shouted. Now, even if I can shout all I like, no one will hear me. No one. With all this soundproofing, no one can hear me. But I'll get even with it one of these days. I'll get it. One more thing, just one more thing on sexuality. Remember that little singer, Extraordinary? She's petite, and her eyes as black as coals, maybe Jewish. Who cares? Anyway, her name is Sarah. Now there's the woman for me. Oh yes. You know, I could never fall in love with a cellist, nor a viola. Even though, talking instrumental compatibility, a double bass and viola go together exceptionally well in the upper range. Take Dittersdorf Sinfonia Concertante. See, a trombone is all right too, and so is cello. But mostly we just play in octaves with the cellos anyway. But in human terms, it's not for me. As a double bassist, I need a woman who represents a complete opposite of myself. Lightness, musicality, beauty, happiness, fame, and she must have a good bust. Yeah? See, I went to the music library to see if there was something there for us. Yeah. 2 whole arias for soprano and obbligato double bass. 2 whole arias. And of course, they had to be by that totally obscure Johann Sperger, Orbit 1812, and a nonette by Bach, Cantata 152. But a nonette is like a small orchestra anyway. And so, well, there are 2 pieces we'd have to ourselves. Not enough there to build a relationship. No. I must have a drink. And you know, and what does the soprano need anyway? Let's not fool ourselves. A soprano needs a coach. Yes, a decent pianist, or better, a conductor. A theater director would be okay. Even a technical director would be more used to her than a double bass. You know, I think she once had a fling with our own technical director here. And that man is the worst kind of bureaucrat, a totally unmusical apparatchik, fat, randy old bastard. And gay with it too. Well, anyway, maybe they didn't. In all honesty, I don't know. And I really couldn't give a damn either. No. In another way, though, it would be a shame because, see, I couldn't go to bed with the kind of woman who sleeps with our technical director. can never forgive her. But it's not a question of that yet. See, right now, it's a question of whether we'll ever get that far. Because up until now, she doesn't even know who I am. I don't think she's ever noticed me. Not musically. Poof, that would be impossible. Now, maybe in the canteen. See, my appearance isn't as bad as my playing, but she's hardly ever in the canteen. She's always been asked out by aging singers, by guest stars, to eat in expensive fish restaurants. You know, I had a look once, you know. A Dover sole there costs 45 euros. Yes, I think it's obscene. I find that thing obscene. It's obscene. A young thing and a 50-year-old tenor? Ugh. I mean, he earns 10,000 euros for 2 evenings' work. 10,000 euros for 2 evenings' work. You know how much I earn? 500 a month after tax. Now, if we're doing some recordings or I'm filling for somebody else, maybe a little extra, but I reckon to earn 500 a month. Nowadays, that's what a junior office worker gets, or a student doing a part-time job. And what are their qualifications? None. None whatsoever. Whereas, see, I spent 4 years at music college. I studied composition under Professor Crouchnick and harmony under Professor Rieder. Yes. Now, I have 3 hours rehearsal in the morning, 4 hours performance in the evening. And during my time off, I'm on call. I never, ever, ever go to bed before midnight. And on top of that, I'm supposed to practice for Christ's sake. Oh. Yes. But I'd go to a fish restaurant if I wanted to and shell out 45, 50, 60 euros for sole if need be. If you thought I'd so much as bat an eyelid, you'd be wrong. Yeah, but I think it's obscene. Apart from that, all those characters are married anyway. Fine. If she came to me, though she doesn't know me, and said, darling, let's go out and eat Dover sole. And then I'd say, of course, sweetheart. And I don't mind if it costs, what, 45, 50, 60 euros. Because, see, with the lady I love, I'm the complete gentleman. Yeah. But it's obscene. Her going out with other men. Obscene. The lady I love does not go out to fish restaurant with other men night after night. Well, she doesn't know me yet. So that's her only excuse. Yeah. Once she gets to know me, when she finally gets to know me, I don't know. When she finally gets to know me, I tell you, she's really got it coming to her. I promise you. I give you my word on that. Because I won't stand for it from a woman. Just because she happens to be a soprano and someday will be singing Dorabella or Aida or Butterfly and me, just a double bassist, that because of that she goes eating out in fish restaurants? No, I wouldn't have it. I'm sorry. Forgive me. I should moderate my tone, is it? Moderate it. Do you think any woman would ever have me? Dorabella's aria from Act 2, Così fan tutte. You know, when you hear her singing, you'd hardly believe it was the same person. I know she's only had smaller parts up till now. Second flower mating in Parsifal, the temple singer in Aida, the cousin in Butterfly, and so on. But when I listen to her, I promise you, it wrings my heart. Can't put it any other way. And then she goes off to fish restaurants with some guest star or other. And they eat fruit de mer and bouillabaisse. Meanwhile, the man who loves her is standing in a soundproofed room thinking about her with just this grotesque instrument in his hands on which he's unable to play so much as a single note that she can sing. You know what? I think I've always needed a woman who was out of my reach. Yeah. But then someone so far beyond me as she is, that's no good to me either. See, I thought of bringing matters to a head once. See, it was when we were rehearsing Ariadne. She was Echo, which is just a small part, no more than a few bars. And the director only called her up to the front once. She could have seen me from there if she hadn't been concentrating so exclusively on our principal conductor. Yeah, I thought about doing something to get her attention. Perhaps throw down my bass or jab my bow into the cello in front of me, or maybe just play incredibly badly. Well, on Ariadne, someone might have noticed. There are only 2 basses on it. But in the end, I didn't. No, I didn't. It's always easier talking about something than actually doing it. And you don't know our conductor. Oh, he takes a wrong note as a personal insult. Yeah. Would have been a bit juvenile too. Of course, trying to strike up a relationship with a wrong note. And you know, if you're playing in an orchestra and you're all colleagues together, and then suddenly you start deliberately playing badly, fully aware of what you're doing. No, I couldn't do that. No. No way. There's an honest musician lurking somewhere inside me. And I thought, if you have to play badly for her to even notice you, then it's probably better that she doesn't. Yeah, I'm like that. Can't help it. So then, I try to play incredibly beautifully, insofar as the instrument makes it possible. I thought, let that be a sign. If my beautiful playing catches her attention, and if she looks over in my direction and sees me, then she's the woman of my life, my Sarah forevermore. And if she doesn't, well, that would be it. That's how superstitious love makes you. She didn't look. I'd only just started playing beautifully when she had to get up and go back upstage. Nobody else noticed anything either. Not the conductor, not even Harfinger, the first double bass right next to me. Not even he noticed how incredibly beautifully I was playing. Do you go to the opera? A lot? Now imagine you're going to the opera tonight. Festival premiere of Rheingold. Over 2,000 in the audience. Long dresses, dark suits, the fragrance of women's bare backs, freshly washed, perfume, deodorant. The sheen of black silk DJs and bald heads, the sparkle of jewels. See, in the front row, you have the minister president and his cabinet, right? international celebs. In the director's box, the director, with his wife, his girlfriend, his family, his guests of honor. In the principal conductor's box, the principal conductor, his wife, and his guest of honor. And everyone is waiting for Carlo Maria Giulini, the star of the evening. Yes. The doors are quietly closed, chandeliers are hoisted up, the lights are dimmed, bated breath, perfume. Giulini appears. Applause. He bows. His freshly washed hair flops into his eyes. He turns to the orchestra. One final cough, and then silence. He raises his arms, seeks eye contact with the first violin, a nod, another look, one very last cough. And then, in this exalted moment, where the opera is the whole world, and the moment is the moment of creation, when everyone is waiting in tense expectation, holding his breath. And the three Rhine maidens are standing behind the curtains as though transfixed. And then, from the back row of the orchestra, from where the double basses are positioned, there comes the cry of a loving heart, Sarah! Oh, the effect is incredible. The next day, it's all over the papers. I'm thrown out of the orchestra. I go to see her with a bouquet of flowers. She opens the door. Our eyes meet for the first time. I stand there heroically. I say, I am the man who has compromised you. I love you. We fall into each other's arms. Our united bliss, supreme happiness, and the world sinks under our feet. Amen. Of course I've tried to forget about Sarah. Yeah, she's probably a completely inadequate human being. Yeah, hollow character, intellectually dim, unworthy of a man of my stamp. Yes. But then, I hear her voice at every rehearsal. That voice. Oh. That divine sound. You know, a beautiful voice has a kind of intelligence of its own. Yeah. The woman herself can be as stupid as anything. And that's the tragedy of music. And then there is the erotic fascination to which we can all be prone. I'll put it like this. When she sings, Sarah, it gets under my skin in an almost sexual way. Please don't misunderstand this now. Sometimes I wake up in the night shouting because in my dream I heard her singing. Thank goodness I'm soundproofed. I'm all bathing sweat. And then I fall asleep again until my own shouting wakes me again. Now this goes on all night long. She sings, I shout, I go back to sleep. She sings, I shout, I go back to sleep. Now that's sexual magnetism for you. Sometimes, since we're on the subject, She even appears before my eyes in the daytime. Of course, it's just imaginary now. This would sound odd. See, I imagine she's standing very close to me, right? Where my base is now. And I just have to put my arms around her like this, right? With the other hand there, as with the bow. Well, across her behind. Or the other way around, like this. As though approaching my base from the other side for a solo, right? My left hand on her breasts, as though in the third position, in the top string. It's a bit hard to picture, I know. And I'm going with my right hand from the side, down there, right? Like this. And this. I'm an artisan, you know? Oh yes, I work with my hands, really. I'm no musician. I'm no more musical than you are. I love music. I love music. I love music. You know, I can tell when a string is out of tune, and I know the difference between a whole tone and a semitone, but I can't play a single musical phrase. I can't even play a single note beautifully. You heard me. And she just has to open her mouth, and everything that comes out is gorgeous. I mean, gorgeous. Even if she makes 1,000 mistakes, it still sounds gorgeous. Well, it's not the fault of the instrument either. I mean, do you suppose Franz Schubert would have chosen to begin his 8th symphony with an instrument on which it's not possible to play beautifully? Now, just who exactly do you think Schubert is then? Right? It's me. It's me that can't do it. It's my fault. Technically speaking, I can play anything. I mean, technically, I've had an outstanding training. Technically, I could play you the Bottesini Suite. It's the Paganini of the double bass. Technically, and there's not a lot of people can play it, really. Technically, if I really practiced, but I don't practice. I don't have to. I don't practice because I just haven't got it. Because, you see, if I wasn't deficient here, inside, do you understand? Musically. And I'm a judge of that. I'm not that bad. I can still tell. And that's an advantage I have over some others. Yes. I've got control over myself. And God, I know what I am and what I'm not. And if at age 35, I've got a government-paid job for life, playing the double bass in the National Orchestra, then I'm not as stupid as some others who think they're musical geniuses, government-paid geniuses, unrecognized geniuses, indexed linked to death, playing double bass in the National Orchestra. I mean, I could always have taken violin if it came down to it, composition or conducting. But there's not enough there. There's just not enough there. There's just enough for me to be able to scrape around on an instrument I can't abide by. Well enough for the others not to notice how bad I really am. And why do I do it? And why shouldn't I? Why should I be better off than you? Yes, you, bookkeeper, shipping clerk, photo lab assistant, barrister. Or maybe like me, you belong to that privileged class of people who are still permitted to work with their hands. Or maybe like me, you belong to those people out there who break up pavements with pneumatic drills for 8 hours a day. Or those who bang dust bins against dust carts to empty them out 8 hours a day. Is that the sum of your talents? Would you be offended if there was someone else who was better at banging dust bins than you? Are you as full of idealism and selfless devotion to your work as I am? I press down these 4 strings with the fingers of my left hand until they bleed, and I stroke a horsehair bow over them until my right arm is numb. By doing that, I produce the noise that is required of me. A noise! The only difference between us is that I sometimes do my work in tails, right? Tails are provided by the management. Yes. I just need to supply my own shirts. It's about time I got changed, really. I'm sorry I got excited. I didn't mean to get excited. I didn't mean to offend you. We all do what we can as well as we can. And it's not for us to ask how we got there and why we stay and whether. I'm afraid I sometimes have these disgusting fantasies. You must excuse me. Yeah. Earlier, I was imagining Sarah in front of me, yeah? Like my double bass. Sarah, the woman of my dreams, as a double bass. She, the angel, who who floats on high, way above me in terms of music. Imagined as my lousy crate of a double bass, which I paw with my lousy, grubby, calloused fingers and stroke with my lousy, crappy bow. Bah! It's disgusting sometimes, the way it comes over me when I'm thinking. Irresistible, instinctual, intoxicating. When I'm thinking, my imagination is like a winged horse riding me down. See, a friend of mine said, now, he's been studying philosophy now for 22 years, and he's now doing his PhD. He said, thinking is too difficult to be left to anyone who happens to feel like it. Now, he himself, my friend, he wouldn't sit down and play the hammer clavier either, because he can't. But then everyone seems to be convinced they can think. And there they all go, thinking away. And that's the great error of our times, my friend says. And that's why we have these disasters happening that will finish us all off one day. And I say he's right. I'll say no more. Now, I must get changed. I'm sorry if I've raised my voice a bit, but when I've had some beer, it does tend to get a bit louder. See, as a member of the National Orchestra, I'm like a government employee, and I can't be dismissed. I've got a set number of hours per week. 5 weeks holiday per year. Insurance if I'm ill. All right? Automatic salary rise every other year. Pension in due course. I'm completely secure. You know, sometimes I get so scared. I hardly dare to leave home. Oh yes. That's how secure I am. You know, in my free time, I have a lot of free time. I prefer to stay at home, as I am now. I'm frightened. How can I explain it to you? Right? It's anxiety. A kind of panic. You know, I've got this awful fear of my security. Right? It's a kind of claustrophobia, a job security psychosis, especially playing the double bass. See, there aren't any freelance double bassists, you know. as a bass player, you're engaged for life. For life. Even our principal conductor hasn't got that kind of security. He's on a 5-year contract. And if they choose not to extend it, well, he's out on his ear. Right? In theory, anyway. Same with the director. Oh, yes. The director is all so powerful, but he can't do that. I mean, if our director puts on an opera, say, by way of example, by Henze, he'd get the sack. Oh, yes. Not immediately on the spot, but it would be a certainty. Because, you know, Henze was a communist. That's right. And that's not what the national stages are meant for. Or, well, there could be some kind of a political intrigue. Because, see, but they'll never sack me, though. No. I can play and not play whatever I like. They'll never, ever sack me. All right. You can say I'm taking a chance. That it was always like that. Orchestra players were always engaged for life. 2 centuries ago, you see, you worked for the court. Today, you work for the state. But then at least the Duke might die, and there was a chance the court orchestra might be disbanded. In theory, anyway. Today, that's absolutely out of the question. Inconceivable, come what may. Now, even in the war, older colleagues have told me, right? The bombs have fallen. The whole city is in ruins, practically razed to the ground. The opera building is in flames. Down in the cellar is the National Orchestra. Next rehearsals at 9 o'clock. It's desperate. Yes. I suppose I could hand in my resignation. I can go along and say, that's it. I resign. It would be unusual, though. Not a lot of people have ever done that. But I could do it. It would be legal. And then I'll be free. Free at last. Thank God Almighty, I'm free at last. And then what? What then? I'm out on the street. It's desperate. A wretched situation either way, except if I chuck in the performance tonight and shout, Sarah, would be an act of ruthlessness in front of the minister-president. To her greater glory and my dismissal, it would be without parallel. The cry of a double bassist. Panic might break out, or I'd be shot by the minister-president's bodyguard. A reflex action on his part, right? Or he misses, or shoots the guest conductor by accident. In any case, something would have happened. My life would be decisively changed. Yes, it would be a new chapter in my biography. And even if I don't get Sarah, then at least she'll never forget me, ever. I'll be the unforgettable anecdote of her career, of her life. And that would be worth a shout. Oh yes. And then I'll be sacked like a director. Perhaps I really will do it. Yes. Perhaps I'll go there now, as I am. Get into the orchestra pit and shout, "Gentlemen!" Well, the other possibility is chamber music. Behave myself, be good, practice, a lot of patience, become first bass in a B orchestra, a little chamber music group, an octet, do a recording, be flexible, reliable, make a bit of a name for myself in all modesty, and prepare myself for the Trout Quintet. See, when Schubert was my age, he was already 3 years dead. Yes, 3 years dead. Well, I've got to go now. It starts at 7:30. But I'll play one more recording for you, okay? Schubert, Quintet, for piano, violin, viola, cello, and double bass, right? It was written in 1819. In A major, by the way, right? It was commissioned by a mine owner in Steyr. I'll set it up before I leave. Well, I'm going now. Off to the opera right now to shout if I dare. You can read about it in the papers tomorrow. See ya.